The galaxy will bend to our will.
Every civilization in the Compact had a vault. A place where the things too dangerous to share, too embarrassing to admit, too fragile to risk leaking, got locked away under the highest classification each species could invent. Humanity had one too. Except humanity's vault wasn't full of human secrets. It was full of everyone else's. The Compact Joint Archive Division sat on a station nobody talked about much. 3 relay jumps past the ascending corridor's outer boundary, staffed by representatives from all 18 member species and run, for the last 19 years, by a quiet human archivist named Dr. Sefu Ademi Reyes. Nobody outside the division knew his name. That was deliberate. That was the entire point of the job. The Joint Archive existed because 60 years into the Compact's existence, somebody had finally asked the obvious question: what happens to a species' most sensitive information if that species collapses, fractures, or simply forgets why the secret mattered in the first place? Every species had history like that. Empires that fell, civil wars that erased records on purpose, bad decades where the wrong people got access to the wrong information and entire archives got burned to make sure nobody else ever found them. The solution the Compact settled on was an institution nobody loved and everybody needed. A single neutral repository, where any member species could deposit its most sensitive secrets, military vulnerabilities, historical embarrassments, technologies too dangerous to develop further, internal records too destabilizing to release, under conditions so strict that even the depositing species couldn't access what they'd left without triggering a review process involving every other member. The idea was that nobody could weaponize what they couldn't reach. The problem was nobody trusted anybody else to run it. The SRI had the institutional memory, but everyone assumed they already knew most of the secrets anyway and resented the idea of formalizing what they suspected was already informal. The Keth had the diplomatic standing, but their federated government structure meant nobody could guarantee long-term institutional continuity. The Reach had the administrative infrastructure, but their history of attempted integrations meant nobody wanted them anywhere near everyone else's leverage points. Humanity got the job nobody else wanted and everybody else, eventually, trusted. Partly because humanity was new enough to have no history of betraying anyone yet. Partly because the human delegation, represented at the founding negotiation by an aging but still sharp Lena Vazek, had proposed something nobody else had thought to propose: a system where the archivists themselves never knew what they were storing. The vaults were sealed before arrival, encrypted with keys split across every depositing species' own systems, requiring simultaneous authorization from at least 9 separate member governments to ever open. The human staff who maintained the facility rotated, vetted, and replaced on careful schedules to prevent any single person from accumulating too much institutional knowledge of patterns. Never saw contents. Only containers. Only manifests stripped of anything but storage requirements. Humans kept the vault, humans never looked inside it. That was the deal, that was why it worked. Dr. Sefu Ademi Reyes had run the division for 19 years without once requesting access to anything stored in it, which made him either the most trusted archivist in Compact history or the most disciplined, and probably both. He was the great-grandson of Yusuf Ademi, the man who'd spent 41 days writing the truest possible thing to send to an unknown species older than language. He'd grown up around a family that treated information with a specific kind of reverence, not secrecy, exactly, but care. The understanding that some things mattered too much to handle carelessly in either direction. He had been offered more than once over 19 years opportunities to advance into roles with more visibility, more prestige, more recognition. He turned every one of them down. His reasoning, when his deputy finally asked him directly in year 15 why he'd stayed so long in a job nobody outside the division even knew existed, was simple. Somebody has to be boring enough to be trustworthy. I'm good at boring. I'd rather be good at this than impressive at something else. The test came in year 19 on a Tuesday, when the Vethkal Collective submitted an emergency request. They needed access to a vault sealed 43 years earlier, before the collective had even formally joined the compact, containing records from a period of internal conflict so severe that 3 different Vethkal governments had each, in succession, agreed it needed to be locked away permanently. The request came with 9 authorization signatures, the minimum required, and a justification that made Seth's stomach turn cold the moment he read it. A faction within the collective's military command structure had begun citing the sealed conflict as historical precedent for a course of action that several senior officers, including notably General Velthrankal, who'd spent the last several years building one of the most productive joint relationships the UEDF had with any non-compact military, considered deeply dangerous if it moved forward unchecked. They needed the sealed records to prove definitively why the precedent didn't apply. But the request had a problem. 9 signatures was the legal minimum. It wasn't enough, on its own, to override the system that Lena Vazek had designed 60 years earlier specifically to prevent any single political moment from being able to force open a vault under pressure. The system required something else. It required the Joint Archive Division's director to personally certify that the request represented genuine institutional consensus rather than a faction maneuvering quickly while attention was elsewhere. It required Sefu to make a judgment call about a species' internal politics that he had spent 19 years specifically refusing to learn enough about to make. He had 6 hours before the faction's window of opportunity closed, and the precedent, real or not, would already have shaped a decision that couldn't be unmade. He called General Velthrankal directly, which was not standard procedure, and which violated at least the spirit of the neutrality he'd spent 19 years protecting. He did it anyway because the alternative was guessing. He said, I have 9 signatures requesting access to Vault 41. I need to understand what's actually happening before I certify anything. There was a long pause on the other end. Velthrankal said, you're not supposed to ask questions like that. Sefu said, I'm not asking what's in the vault. I'm asking whether the 9 signatures represent the collective or represent a faction moving fast enough that the rest of the collective hasn't caught up yet. Another pause longers. Velthrankal said, the second one. The faction is real, the urgency is manufactured, and 3 of those 9 signatures were obtained from officials who didn't fully understand what they were authorizing access to. I've spent 2 days trying to slow this down through internal channels and I'm losing. Sefu said, then I need something from you that isn't going to be comfortable to provide. Velthrankal said, say it. Sefu said, I need a 10th signature. Yours. Specifically refusing certification with your reasoning attached entered into the same emergency record as the original 9. Not because I can't make this decision, because the decision needs a record that shows the collective itself was divided, not unified. If I just quietly decline to certify based on a private conversation, the faction gets to claim the human archivist blocked legitimate Vethkal business. If you formally object on the record, this becomes a Vethkal internal disagreement that the Joint Archive correctly identified and correctly declined to resolve on anyone's behalf. A long silence. Velthrankal said, you're asking me to put my name on the record against 3 senior officers in a system everyone will eventually see. Sefu said, yes. Velthrankal said, why would I do that? Sefu said, because if you don't, and this faction gets what they want using 43-year-old records as justification for whatever they're planning, You'll spend the rest of your career wishing you'd put your name on something when it mattered instead of staying quiet to protect your position. He paused. I've watched you build something real with the UEDF over 6 years. I don't think you want to watch it get used as precedent justification by people who weren't in the room for any of it. The silence this time had a different quality. Velthrankal said, "Send me the certification language. I'll have it back to you in 20 minutes. He had it back in 14. Sefu filed the non-certification decision with Velthrankal's formal objection attached, sealed the request as incomplete pending full collective consensus, and sent notification to all 9 original signatories explaining, in careful procedural language, exactly why a 10th voice from a senior officer changed the nature of the request from a legitimate emergency into an internal disagreement requiring the collective's own resolution process. The factions window closed 3 hours later. What happened inside the Vethkal collective over the following weeks was not Sefu's business, and he made a point of never finding out the details, because finding out wasn't his job and had never been his job. What he did learn 4 months later, from a brief and uncharacteristically warm message from Velthrankal, was that the faction had been formally censured, the precedent argument had been thoroughly redited once full collective leadership reviewed it, and the collective's senior command had quietly noted, in an internal report Sefu was never shown but heard about second-hand, that the Joint Archive Division's refusal to certify under pressure had probably prevented a serious internal crisis. The message ended with a line that Sefu kept, the way his family kept the things that mattered, written down on paper, filed somewhere it wouldn't get lost. It said you could have certified it. 9 signatures was enough by the letter of the rule. You chose to ask a harder question instead. I am Vethkal, and we do not often say this to outsiders, but you assessed correctly and the assessment was generous to give us because it let our problem stay our problem to fix. Thank you for being boring enough to be trustworthy. Sefu read it twice, he filed it. His deputy, a careful young Sarathvel archivist who'd been with the division for 3 years, asked him afterward whether he'd been afraid. Making that call, putting that much weight on a single judgment about a species he'd spent 2 decades deliberately not studying too closely. Sefu thought about it for a long moment. He said, I wasn't making a judgment about the Vethkal. I was making a judgment about whether 9 signatures under time pressure looked like consensus or looked like a faction moving fast. That's not the same question. I didn't need to know their politics to ask whether the politics looked rushed. His deputy said, how did you know to ask? Sefu said, my great-grandfather spent 41 days writing one message to something nobody had ever successfully communicated with because he refused to send anything less than the truest thing he could find in the time he had. I've spent 19 years thinking that's what this job actually is. Not guarding secrets. Making sure that when something gets unlocked, it's because the truth required it, not because the clock did. His deputy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, every other species vault holds their own secrets. We hold everyone's and we never even look. Sefu said, that's the whole design. Lena Vazik figured out 60 years ago that the only species anyone would trust with this job was the one willing to be boring enough, careful enough, and disciplined enough to never want to peek. His deputy said, does it bother you, holding things you'll never understand about people who'll never fully trust you forever? Sefu thought about General Velthrankal's message, filed away with the others. He thought about 19 years of being the quietest, least visible, most procedurally boring official in the entire Compact's diplomatic infrastructure, and how exactly none of that had ever once felt like wasted time. He said, I don't hold their secrets so I can understand them. I hold their secrets so they don't have to be afraid of what happens if their own history gets used against them by people who weren't careful with it. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole job. He looked at the vault corridor outside his office window, rows of sealed containers from 18 species. 60 years of accumulated history nobody on staff had ever opened, humming quietly under environmental systems that had never once failed. He said, every civilization keeps their best secrets. We just turned out to be the only ones everyone eventually trusted enough to keep theirs too. As he went back to work, there was always another request to review, another signature to verify, another careful judgment call waiting in the queue that required nothing more dramatic than someone willing to ask one more question before signing off. Well, he was good at that. He intended to keep being good at it for as long as they'd let him.